Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be doing a couple videos about the Genovese family in Springfield, Massachusetts. On this video, I'm going to do some history and backstories about the origins of the Springfield mob. The relationship between the Genovese family in Springfield, Massachusetts goes back about 100 years. Antonio Tony Miranda married Pasqualina Albano after her first husband bit the dust shortly after the beginning of Prohibition. This was New York City's relationship with Springfield began. I briefly talked about some of these things that I'm going to cover in these videos when I did the Frey-Gius video, but I'll go into much greater detail in this series. Shout out to bootleggers and Damien Fournier, two Springfield guys that watch my videos and they wanted another video about the Springfield mob. Thanks for watching and commenting on my videos. I hope you guys enjoy. So without further ado, let's get into the first installment and learn some history about the Springfield mob. So Springfield, the third largest city in Massachusetts, which annually has one of the highest violent crimes per capita rates in the state, sits right on the western bank of the Connecticut River, and its connection with the New York Genovese family goes back about a century. By the turn of the 20th century, most of the Northeast was undergoing industrialization and urbanization. Springfield, like most other cities in central and western Mass that were located on large rivers, utilized the hydroelectric power. Springfield quickly became a manufacturing hub, and now in these politically unstable times has the dubious distinction as one of the largest gun-producing cities in the world. The world-famous Smith & Wesson gun-making company set up operations in Springfield, Mass. They call the area that contains several of the biggest gun manufacturing factories in western Mass down to the Colt factory in Connecticut, Gun Valley. It really is ironic that some of the most liberal states with the strictest gun laws and lowest gun death rates house some of the largest manufacturers in the country. Either way, around the turn of the century, with growth of Springfield, came waves of immigrants to help build and work in the factories. One of the main groups that came to Springfield were the Italians. A small wave of northern Italians had come after the Civil War about a generation earlier than the second larger wave in the late 1890s and early 1900s. These immigrants were from poor southern Italy and Sicily. These immigrants were less educated and skilled and dealt with a great deal of discrimination when they first arrived. The first generation of southern Italian immigrants worked as railroad workers and in construction, helping to build the growing city. Others still worked independently as street vendors and other small family-run businesses. These are the types of people that early Italian-American gangs like the Black Hand used to harass and extort. By the beginning of the 1920s, the south end of Springfield was firmly Italian, and with the onset of Prohibition, the quote-unquote mafia would get its foot in the door. The Volstead Act was passed by the United States government, and it gave criminals an opportunity to make a lot of illicit cash and fast. I could say it was a noble idea, and at least in spirit its intentions were good, but honestly, it was a very stupid law that makes no sense now, and it made little sense then. They were trying to curb alcoholism by making liquor illegal. It didn't work at all. All it did was create a black market economy and put a lot of money in the hands of criminals. And oh yeah, it also corrupted countless law enforcement officers, government officials, and lawmakers. It's basically akin to the United States' current losing war on drugs. The United States government thought that they could end drug addiction, drug sales, and trafficking if they put a prohibition on it and made it illegal. Perhaps they're starting to realize that's a losing mentality. Or have they? I don't know, just go look at the mass and cast human fucking travesty and tell me your opinion. But that's not why I bring up Prohibition. I bring up Prohibition because that is how Italian gangsters originally got their foot in the door. Shortly after the beginning of Prohibition, the illegal sales of liquor began all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and Springfield was no different. An Italian immigrant who lived in a cold water flat in Springfield's Italian South End quickly became the city's preeminent bootlegger. Carlo Cincinelli, within 1 year of Prohibition, moved from a cold water flat in Springfield's South End to a big house in a much more affluent part of town. He had a chauffeur drive him around daily in a big old Lincoln limousine. Carlo was an immigrant from a village called Quindici, outside of Avellino next to Naples. Now, obviously, Carlo didn't become a bootlegger kingpin out of nowhere. He obviously had connections and help. But where did his connections come from, you ask? Well, the truth is that the majority of the power in Springfield from the time of the first Italian immigrants arriving in the city throughout Prohibition was from his wife Pasqualina and her family, the Albanos. They were the real power in the early Springfield Italian community. Pasqualina Albano was the niece of John Jack Albano, who was a leader in the young Springfield Italian community. He and his sons were in the legal alcohol business before Prohibition. They were successful businessmen and prominent leaders in their community. Upon the onset of Prohibition, like most people in the liquor business, they just moved their operations underground. Unfortunately for John, though, he passed away on the eve of Prohibition. Two of his oldest sons died very young, so control of the liquor business fell into the hands of his niece Pasqualina and her new husband, Carlos Scabbelli. I said it right. It's definitely worthy of note the importance of the Albano family in Springfield's Italian community. Felix Albano, John's younger son, became a very important labor leader in the 1960s and 70s, and John's grandson, Michael Albano, actually became the mayor of Springfield. Carlo became the face of the operation because he was a man, and that's how things worked in the 1920s and in Italian culture. But Pasqualina Albano was the real conduit of power and influence in the Springfield underworld. Within a year of taking over the Albano family bootlegging operations, Carlo's lifestyle had dramatically changed. The poor immigrant from Condici outside Avellino married Pasqualina, whose family was from the nearby village outside Naples called Brasigliano. Brasigliano and Quindici are very important to the Springfield Mafia. A lot of guys came from these villages. They moved from a cramped one-room cold water flat in the South End to a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a lofty upper-class neighborhood in Springfield. He had a chauffeur drive him daily to his meetings and other engagements in a beautiful old Lincoln limousine. It was clear that Carlo was a man on the rise, but unfortunately for him, it was a quick rise and fall. Within a year of taking over the operations, Carlos Scabbelli was waiting in the back of his beautiful old Lincoln for his chauffeur to go and retrieve him a cigar. He was shot to death at the age of 37 in 1921, most likely by rivals trying to take over his operations. Carlo left behind 2 orphan sons who went on to live with the Albano relatives and eventually became grocers. Like I said previously, the real power in the underworld during Prohibition centered around Pasqualina, who had control of the Albano Empire. After, I'm sure, a very sad grieving process, Pasqualina married Antonio "Tony" Miranda, a connected man from New York City. This was the beginning of the Genovese influence and control in the city of Springfield, but I'm being just a little premature on that. The Genovese family at this point wasn't even the Genovese family. Lucky Luciano hadn't made his move yet to set up the commission that ruled over the national syndicate with the 5 families at the head. But with that being said, this was a time period when New York Italian gangsters were sending out representatives to cities all around the Northeast and Midwest trying to get a foot in the local rackets. Obviously the main focus being on illegal bootlegging. Antonio "Tony" Miranda was a friend of Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. Also, his brother was Michael Miranda, who would go on to be Vito Genovese's future consigliere. These young Turks of the Italian underworld set out to take control of the lucrative rackets from the old world mustache Petes. I obviously don't have any intimate knowledge of Pasqualina and Antonio's marriage, but it would seem to an observer that this was a bit of a political marriage. Antonio Miranda and Pasqualina ruled over the city of Springfield during the height of Prohibition and gained an enormous amount of wealth. The two moved from the nice house that Pasqualina previously shared with her deceased husband, Carlos Scabbelli, to an even more beautiful mansion. Unfortunately, though, for Mr. Miranda, he wasn't able to enjoy his power and life of luxury for too long, when in 1930, Antonio Miranda died of an apparent blood poisoning. This would be husband number 2 to pass away in less than 10 years. According to the news reports of the time, Miranda had an extravagant funeral procession including 22 flower cars, 147 limousines, and a plane that flew overhead sprinkling the street with rose petals. Could it have been that Pasqualina really loved her Antonio and wanted to have a funeral fit for a king? Or was she just trying to make a good show for the New York gangsters, who might have been at this point seeing her as a bit of a threat? After the death of her second husband, Pasqualina married a 34-year-old Italian immigrant named Joseph Fiore. She was probably hoping that Fiore could protect her and her huge empire. Fiore had been previously charged with an attempted murder in Connecticut and a stabbing of a police officer in Springfield. Apparently, Fiore wasn't afraid of violence. It mattered little, though, because shortly after their union on November 12, 1932, Pasqualina and Joseph were shot in a drive-by shooting. 2 automatic weapons and a sawed-off shotgun were used. Fiore was badly wounded but survived. But unfortunately for the Queenpin, Pasqualina Albano, Scabbelli, Miranda, Fiore, aka the Black Widow. Just so you guys know, I'm the only one calling her that. No one else calls her that. She died from her wounds. It was most likely gangsters from New York behind the slang, trying to regain control of the city's rackets from Pasqualina after Miranda's death, but I can't say if that's fact, but it's most likely the case. And as for Joseph Fiore, he didn't last long on the streets after Pasqualina passed. Less than a year later, while getting his hair cut at a South End barbershop, Joseph Fiore was attacked and shot to death. A year later, in 1933, the Volstead Act was repealed and the lifeblood of the gangsters was gone. So the enterprising gangsters took all the capital that they earned from bootlegging and invested into the rackets that we associate with organized crime today, like loan sharking, bookmaking, narcotics trafficking, and union infiltration. And thus begins the modern-day Italian mafia as we now know it. This was also the time when New York installed what they called capodecinas around the Northeast and cities to try to get a foothold on the rackets. The man that was to run Springfield for the New York Genovese family would be Salvatore Big Nose Sam Cuffari. This year marks the official beginning of New York City's influence and control over the city of Springfield, Mass. The New York Mafia was sending out these capodecinas all over the region. Frank Iacone, a mentor to the young Raymond Patriarca, was installed to run operations in the gritty central Mass city of Worcester. It was said that Raymond's ceremony as becoming boss in New England took place at Iacone's with all the major bosses in attendance. Salvatore Big Nose Sam Cuffari was born in a small town called Bianco in Calabria in the far south of Italy. Calabria is just south of Naples, where the Albanos hailed from. Calabria is home to the dreaded 'Ndrangheta, which is the region's organization like the Sicilian Mafia or the Neapolitan Camorra. Cuffari was shown by the U.S. Census to have resided in Springfield as early as 1920, and he made trips with his wife back and forth to Cuba in the early 1930s. Big Nose Sam was busy during Prohibition building his underworld resume. He had been arrested more than a dozen times during his bootlegging career, even once being shot by police trying to run a roadblock in Granby, Connecticut. In 1924, Cuffari stabbed a man on Christmas Eve, allegedly at a gas station. Apparently, the gas station attendant gave him bad service. The gas station employer refused to identify him and charges were dropped, a pattern that seemed to follow Big Nose Sam throughout his life. Cuffari was charged with all types of offenses over a period of 6 decades, but never did a day in prison. By 1948, Cuffari was the undisputed boss of Springfield, Mass, and answered to Vito Genovese. Now, all the chaos from Prohibition in the early 30s had settled. Charles Lucky Luciano had laid the groundwork for the commission and how the modern-day mafia should operate. Luciano would be deported back to Italy by the end of the 1930s, leaving his Borgata to Frank Costello. Costello had a brilliant mind, numerous business and political contacts. He also thought diplomatically. He thought force to be a last result. Underneath him, the brutal Vito Genovese thought much differently. Genovese was power-hungry and thought Costello was weak. He wanted to take control of the Borgata. Genovese sent Vincent the Cingigante to assassinate Costello, but luckily for Frank, the bullet just grazed his head. He got the message, though, and retired, leaving the family to Vito Genovese. Genovese, who quickly changed the name of the Borgata to his own and asserted his dominance in vicious fashion. The Genovese family, which was originally the Luciano Borgata, has pretty much from the beginning been the preeminent family in organized crime. For a time, perhaps, the Gambino family eclipsed them, and there were times that saw the Lucchese's and the Colombos gain strength, but the Genovese family has consistently been the number one force in the Italian underworld. Originally, Springfield was overseen by the New Jersey faction of the Genovese family, which was run by Willie Moretti. That is until Moretti was killed in 1951. The rumor mill states that Moretti was suffering from advanced stages of syphilis and was being called to testify in front of the U.S. Senate. Moretti worried his contemporaries. Syphilis in its advanced stages affects your cognitive abilities, and they probably thought he would say too much, so they took care of him. Believed to be involved in the slaying was Ralph Whitey Tropiano of the Albano family, who probably as a reward was given New Haven, Connecticut, which he ruled over. Tropiano was the mentor of a young wild guy, Bill Grosso, who would later take control of the city of New Haven and become underboss of the Patriarca family, and also get into many beefs with the Springfield mob. Big Nose Sam Cuffari was very quiet and low-key as the boss of Springfield. He wasn't a man with a lot of flash. He was a very powerful, important man, though, and was present at the infamous Appalachian meeting in 1957 that was broken up by authorities. The U.S. government was never able to convict him on criminal charges, so they were constantly harassing him and trying to strip him of his American citizenship and deport him back to Italy. Cuffari ran his operations out of an Italian restaurant called Ciro's on Main Street in Springfield's Italian South End. Big Nose Sam suffered a stroke in the 1970s, but still maintained his grip on the Springfield rackets. That's until 1977, when because of his age and health, he retired from being boss of Springfield, before finally passing away in 1983. Big Nose Sam ran Springfield quietly and effectively for the Genovese family for almost a half a century. Big Nose Sam built up a strong power base in the South End, and by the end of his days, the city was a mafia town through and through. The man that took over the city of Springfield after Big Nose Sam would be none other than another old-school gangster named Francisco Frankie Skyball Scabbelli. Francesco Frankie Skyball Scabbelli, along with his brothers Albert Baba Scabbelli and Anthony the Turk Scabbelli, were old-school mafioso. The Scabbelli family, which originally hailed from Quindici and Avellino, one of the two main towns that these Springfield mafioso guys originally came from, was involved in the Springfield rackets going back to the early 1930s. Frankie Skyball was from the same generation as Big Nose Sam. He was old school. But unlike Cuffari, Scabbelli had done time in prison. In 1961, Skyball was running an illegal gambling ring from telephone booths at a hospital. Man, life before cell phones, eh? Anyhow, a Catholic nun who observed what he was doing dropped the dime on Scabbelli, and he was subsequently arrested. The nun was hoping for Francesco to be rehabilitated, but unfortunately God had made Frankie Skyball a gangster. The judge was unusually harsh on Scabbelli, reading him the riot act in court. The judge told Scabbelli and his co-defendant Paul the Penman Carteropoli that in his district, we don't want bookies, we don't want cheap ones or prosperous ones here, and we aren't going to have them. He said this before sentencing both men to 19 months in prison, a very stiff sentence for that kind of crime at that time. Frankie Skyball Scabbelli, a South End Springfield native, would go on to become one of the most powerful mobsters in Springfield throughout the 1960s and 70s. Along with Cuffari, Scabbelli became one of the standout gangsters for the Genovese family in the city of Springfield. After Big Nose Sam passed away in 1983, Skyball would rise up to the capo status in the Genovese family, running the Springfield crew for his boss, if only in name, Fat Tony Salerno. Scabbelli would rule Springfield until his death in 2000 at the old age of 87 years old. Along with his brothers, one of Skyball's main guys was future Springfield boss Big Al Bruno. The two would be caught up in a federal indictment in the late 1980s that would see Skyball seeing prison once again. Now this, ladies and gentlemen, is where I'm going to leave off on part 1 of the Springfield Genovese crime crew. On part 2, I'm going to jump in to the meatiest and most exciting part of this story. Adolfo Big Al Bruno taking control of the family after Skyball's running the crew through the 1980s and 90s, and then when he was turned on by his young protege and almost like a nephew to Big Al, the Springfield supervillain, Anthony Ariolata.